Okay, hello everybody. Last paper before the lunch. Dr. Julia McClure is a senior lecturer in late medieval and early modern global history in the School of Humanities at the University of Glasgow. She specializes in the history of poverty, charity, and inequality in the Spanish Empire in the late medieval period. She's the author of The Franciscan Invention of the New World, which explores the role of missionaries and the ideology of poverty in the early Atlantic world. And her forthcoming book, which I just saw the tweet, you can pre-order from Amazon, Empire of Poverty, The Moral Political Economy of the Spanish Empire, is coming out from Oxford. Julia is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She's the founder of the Poverty Research Network and Food Sovereignty Network, which works with grassroots organization in Scotland and around the world to examine the challenges to food sovereignty, including historic issues such as land access, the structure of the capitalist system, and global supply chains and legacies of colonialism. Julia is a dear friend and often collaborator, fiercely honest scholar, intellectually daring, and a profoundly astute intellectual who has influenced my thinking over the past 10 years. Julia, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Amitava, for this really kind introduction. And it's really fantastic to be here today. Amitava and I have done a number of conferences online, and they were very, very good, but it's nice to be in a room with real people, and it's been great to sort of catch up with old friends and also to make lots of new ones. So thank you very much for this, Amitava. And also just thank you in general for the work that you've been doing in sort of advancing global history. And when you've been sort of thinking about these conferences, keeping global history true to its original objectives of kind of stretching the boundaries. And I think that the work that you've been doing on this is fantastic. Thank you also to Daniel and the other organisers for all the work that I know goes into making these conferences possible and indeed very enjoyable. So this conference is called Remapping Categories and Concepts. And the concepts that I want to remap here are poverty and wealth. I also want to remap our understanding of the historic relationship between these two concepts. I'm going to do something unfashionable, which is to read my paper. I could give you a presentation in another form, but I couldn't guarantee what it would be about after hearing 2 days of fascinating talks, and it certainly wouldn't be 15 minutes. So do excuse this. This project that I want to present to you with the time that I've got with you is it's outlining a new direction of research, or kind of development of my research. And in the presentation that I've got here, in the time that I've got, I want to give a bit of an indication of where it's come from and also kind of where it's going. And I want to kind of try to keep to my 15 minutes so that I have the space for the questions, because I think your feedback will be really valuable. So as Amitava mentioned, my second monograph is coming out. It's going to be published in December. So I'm talking about it here partly to indicate the kind of ideas that this new project is grounded in, and partly for shameless self-publication. We know that there are multiple things, multiple truths kind of coexist. And mentioning this book, I also want to say a big thank you to Sven, who's in the room, because he read an early draft of this manuscript, I think from the beach in Greece, and sent it in the post, stand and all, with really helpful feedback that has improved the book, I think, a lot. And it kind of goes to show the importance of these communities that we build here, and how it kind of pushes us to think. So thank you for this. So in the book, I argue that poverty is not an absolute economic condition, but also a moral political concept. I argue that the way poverty has been conceptualized and the way it's been ordered by laws and institutions has shaped the material manifestation of poverty and the contours of inequality. The book focuses on the long 16th century and the foundations of colonial capitalism. This is the start of the early modern period, which is often framed by early modern economic historians as an escape from poverty. I want to sort of see this period rather not as the escaping, but rather the remaking of poverty. I begin by reminding readers of Marx's analysis of what he called, and I quote, the antagonistic character of capitalist accumulation. Marx recognized the accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony and toil, slavery, ignorance and brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, end quote. Marx called this process pauperization. While classic Marxist analysis has seen the transition to capitalism and the making of poverty as a material process, Empire of Poverty examines the remaking of poverty also as an ideological process. It examines the role of moral political beliefs in facilitating this shift in ideology and material conditions in the increasingly global imperial context of the long 16th century. So finishing the book and thinking about this conference has been an opportunity to spend more time developing the next big research project, which I'm provisionally entitling A New Global History of the Wealth and Poverty of Nations. This aims to shift the focus of global historical research away from a particular kind of wealth accumulation to a particular kind of poverty creation. At the same time, it will explore the alternatives, decolonizing understandings of wealth and poverty to open new opportunities for understanding the strategies, technologies, and values of abundance. And the paper that I pre-circulated is in some way a start on this. So in the pre-circulated paper, I begin with the provocation that a certain branch of global historical literature, one that arguably grew out of the rise of the West paradigm and developed into the divergence paradigm, has tended to ask a similar question. How was it that the Europe won in this game to gain power and wealth? And how could the rest of the world have won, and could the West of the world have won if they'd played the game better? I call for a new global history that asks not how the West won, but how it failed. Not how the West accumulated wealth, but how it spread a system of poverty and inequality, a system of poverty and inequality that continues to fail both human societies and the natural world. So to some, a new global history of the failure of the West may sound counterfactual. After all, for example, in How Europe Conquered the World, Philip Hoffman tells us that between 1492 and 1914, Europeans conquered 84% of the globe. And much of the divergence literature is underpinned by the data familiar to us all of the economic wealth measured in GDP of Western European countries accelerating, while India and China remain the same or declined. In light of these powerful and well-established metrics, to call for a new global history of the failure of the West may seem like a false premise. But what if we had a different set of metrics, not underpinned by the binary approach of wealth and poverty, but underpinned by a more pluralistic understanding of abundance? How would these graphs look if they were comparing nations over time, not based on GDP, but on metrics such as biodiversity, soil health, common property and public resources, population health and nutrition, or indeed pollution? How would the narrative look if we asked not what superior technologies and institutions enabled successful expansion, but what failures of resource management and physical and moral thresholds of resource extraction and circulation drove Europeans beyond their borders, an expansion driven in part by a manufactured scarcity? As we write global histories in the age of climate crisis, we need to think about how we're telling the story of economic growth, not as a success, but as something that ends poverty, but as a failure that creates new forms of poverty for both people and environments. In the paper, I set out the first step of this remapping of global history, which is to recognize that the normative concepts of wealth and poverty that have been the building blocks for many global historical models are ethnocentric values resulting from a particular Occidental tradition of thought, that of classic liberal economics. By way of contrast, I present the different interpretations of world historical processes and concepts of value resulting from indigenous Mesoamerican societies. Here, both European and indigenous American accounts of the world are understood from the perspective of cosmology and myth. This approach challenges enduring colonial distinctions between the modern and primitive cultures, which are themselves the product of ethnocentric myths of world history. I outline how European myths about indigenous American societies were important to the emergence of theories of political economy and theories of development. For example, Adam Smith used the myths about Native American societies for his stadial theory of human development. Societies thought to be existing in earlier phases were described as barbarous and as poor. This helps us to understand also the racial dimensions of concepts of poverty. Smith argued that, and I quote, "In civilized nations, even of the lowest and poorest order, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessities of life and conveniences of life than it is possible for any," and he uses a racial slur here beginning with S that I won't repeat, to acquire. Marx has critiqued the classical liberal understandings of the relationship between poverty and wealth, arguing that in poor nations, people are comfortable, and in rich nations, they are generally poor. While Marx critiqued classical liberal political economy, he also contributed to myths about indigenous societies in his theories of human history, whilst having little to no knowledge about those indigenous societies. So I argue that we need to challenge certain myths about the history of indigenous American societies if we're going to meaningfully disrupt existing taxonomies of poverty and wealth and decolonize our understanding of indigenous societies. So first, the so-called pristine myth, or myth that the Americas were scarcely populated before the arrival of Europeans. And second, the myth of societal collapse. Both of these myths about the history of indigenous societies have helped sustain notions that indigenous societies were naturally poor and their traditions of production could only maintain communities at subsistence level, and that they were prone to mismanaging their resources in a way that risked not only scarcity, but also extinction. These myths may sound extreme to the people in the room, but they have endured. I argue that we need a new interdisciplinary approach to understandings of anthropogenic forests and soils, like the work of Annabel Ford and Ronald Nye, and the book cover is on the slide here, and sadly Ronald Nye just died last week, so it's a timely mention of his work. They work on the Mayan Forest Garden, and I talk about this in the paper, and I think this offers some methodological insights in the ways that we might reevaluate our understanding of the scale of indigenous societies and their technologies of abundance. The ways in which many of these societies use sustainable materials for their built environments makes the imperial imprint on the archaeological record harder to trace. But new methodologies for reading the histories of anthropogenic forests and soils is opening new possibilities and new insights into the scalability of agroecological practices. I argue that one way to go beyond the colonial myths of indigenous American societies is to explore indigenous Americans' own myths and cosmological understandings. Indigenous myths and cosmovisions offer an alternative perspective on global historical processes. By exploring indigenous myths and cosmologies, we can start to understand the ways in which spatial, temporal, and conceptual orderings have differed from those that developed in Occidental cosmologies. And from here, we can start to understand different moral, political, and economic forms of world ordering and new taxonomies of poverty and wealth. I highlight the following features of Mesoamerican cosmologies: that there was no clear separation between the world of humans, nature, or the gods. Indeed, there was often no distinct word for nature as a distinct entity. That the culture was animistic, disrupting the binary between sacred and celestial worlds and the natural world. That Mesoamerican cosmologies tended to have a cyclical structure, which related to the ways in which creation was an ongoing process. That mundane and celestial worlds were linked, and their interactions were managed through calendars. Festivals and rituals were important to keep these solar cycles in motion, and these rituals demonstrate how Mesoamerican cosmologies were grounded in principles of reciprocity between the mundane and the celestial worlds. Things from nature that sustained life were seen as gifts, and people needed to give back to nature to maintain the possibility of future gifts from nature. Reciprocity was often important in Mesoamerican cosmologies, but significantly, it was embedded within a different relational ontology that was not individualized and had a different timescale that was not linear or immediate. I conclude by arguing that by contrasting these myths about indigenous American societies in the Occidental cosmology of classical liberal economics and the indigenous Americans' own myths and cosmologies, we can start to address the ongoing legacies of colonial violence against human societies and the natural world. Understanding the ethnocentrism of existing normative concepts of poverty and wealth is the first step in realizing new taxonomies of scarcity and abundance. And crucially, these must not prioritize metrics of growth and accumulation, but those of distribution, making the concept of inequality that we also need to sort of rethink central. These also must not prioritize commodity production and circulation, but find new ways of understanding value, scarcity, and abundance. So at the start of this paper today, I suggested these could be things like biodiversity, soil health, common property, and public resources, or population health and nutrition. Paleoarchaeologists have advanced in this arena. For example, is this a new slide? Let's see. No. Paleoarchaeologists have advanced in this region. For example, Richard Steckel and Jerome Rose in the Western Hemisphere project call for making a distinction between wealth and health. They use bioarchaeological indicators, including stature, degenerative joint disease, skeletal infections, dental infections, trauma, and indications of nutritional intake, such as linear enamel hyperplasia and evidence of anemia, to build a picture of health rather than wealth. Their findings show that prior to the 20th century, there were changes for the material standard of living, for the diversity and quality of products that were readily purchased, but, and I quote, these goods were acquired at a significant price to human health. For example, they show that before the 20th century, Euro-Americans were wealthier in terms of material conditions, but that, and I quote, their wealth was insufficient to protect them from poor dental health and the highest rate of degenerative joint disease. Further, they argue that the European-American diet, with its emphasis on starch and sugar, was costly for dental health, and their ways of life involved stressful repetitive motions that led to joint deterioration. So with metrics such as commodity consumption, property ownership, or monetary income, these people would look the wealthiest. But when we look at nutrition, the picture changes. Colonial settlers were wealthier in the sense that they could monopolize multiple forms of capital and maintain imperial inequalities, but they were also advancing a system of colonial poverty with agricultural strategies that degraded soils, extractive industries that caused deforestation, erosion, and other natural disasters, and turned food from the basis of communal life into a commodity, the price of which increased scarcity. So I can hear some of you saying, hasn't this been done before? Isn't this just, aren't I just a charlatan putting new wine in old bottles the other way around, isn't it? You can fix it yourselves. And to some extent, yes, there have been different metrics for poverty and wealth that already exist. So since 2018, the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index measures health, education, and living standards. And the measure's been used by the UN and the World Bank. Since 2014, the European Union has been developing a framework for nature values to measure the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity in different environments. So broadening and diversifying measures of wealth and poverty provides new ways of representing human values and the values of the natural world. But we should also be sensitive to the institutional context and purposes of new measures. So, for example, green financialization and the rapidly evolving carbon credits market is driving new forms of valuation and so-called green assets. And this is often leading to increased displacement of indigenous peoples from places that they've lived in for centuries, with the expansion of fortress conservation. This makes it even more important to work with indigenous communities and understand indigenous ontologies and epistemologies for any global historical remapping of poverty and wealth. So what I propose is rebuilding the concepts of wealth and poverty informed by indigenous histories and the principles of food sovereignty. So in the last years, I've been developing a food sovereignty network, considering what a food sovereignty lens on the global history of poverty might look like. Food sovereignty is not only about the politics of consumption, but also production. It takes into account the health and nutrition of human populations, but also through prioritizing different strategies of agroecology, the health and well-being of the environment. It also values community resources and community management strategies from protecting rivers from chemical fertilizers to seed saving and sharing. And in the last years, I've had the opportunity to visit different agroecological communities in the south of Mexico. And there I've often heard a similar story. This is an area that's classed by the World Bank as poor. And the people would say to me, we're poor, but I didn't know what poverty was until I went to the United States of America and I saw people without food. Now, this isn't an anecdote, but actually there has been a study by the Luxembourg Income Study Group that showed that the USA has the highest median household income, but also the highest percentage of households where people skip meals because there is not enough money for food. So this is a reminder of the problem of labelling states as rich or poor according to aggregate data of GDP, and to not finding ways of representing different values of abundance for human communities and the natural environment. So in summary, in this conference's call to remap categories and concepts in global history, I call for the remapping of poverty and wealth and increased foregrounding of concepts of inequality. I argue that to do so, we need an increased understanding of indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, increased knowledge of anthropogenic forests and soils, and a shift from understandings about wealth to health. This would require decolonial methodologies that prioritize working with indigenous and agroecological peasant communities and interdisciplinary approaches that include new ways of mapping abundance. Thank you.
Thank you for that radical reframing, Julia. Questions? Joe.
Thanks. Julia, I really appreciate all of the wealth of materials that you brought to the story. But I'd like to ask a naive question. So if I think about your project's message, it sounds a lot to me like the message of Raj Patel in Stuffed and Starved, in which he argues that the world has been divided into two populations. There are the diseases of starvation in the developing world, and there are the diseases of affluence in the developed world. And these are a product of capitalist food systems which serve no one. So in what ways do we need more of a history than Raj's manifesto? In what ways will looking at a deeper past enhance this narrative in our understanding?
Yeah, thank you very much for this. And I kind of said there, is this old wine in new bottles? That's the expression, isn't it? And I think that there has been a lot of kind of vision of sort of remapping or reconceptualizing poverty and thinking what this looks like in terms of global comparisons. I suppose I'm calling for a lengthening of the chronology around this to incorporate global Middle Ages and to think about kind of what the alternatives are as well, and especially sort of rethinking how people have had these alternative strategies of abundance that actually have also raised populations above subsistence level, but they've also been thinking about kind of what the limits are within that in terms of the relationship with the environment. And I'm not entirely sure of this particular thesis, but how these things about poverty and wealth exist side by side. So this is often disguised by the kind of aggregate data. We're not kind of divided into rich nations and poor nations, but these things are existing side by side.
Marnie.
All right, I'm going to challenge you here because you said you wanted to be challenged. Is this a history of humans, or should this be a history of place and environment? Because where I come from, we talk about nourishing terrains and abundance. In indigenous ontologies, the separation of human from the environment is an act of capital and alienation. That's not right. So the argument would be, should this actually be a global history of place and nourishing terrains rather than the poverty of a single species?
I think that's where I'd like to go with this, finding a metric that kind of transcends our kind of normative anthropocentric approaches to how we've thought about poverty and wealth, and thinking about how this needs to kind of relate to the environmental context. And as I mentioned, there's often not this distinction between the human and the natural worlds. There's seen as this kind of mutability between the two. And I think that kind of that dividing of nature is seen as something, as backdrop to history. Yeah, I know a lot of work has been done in this area, but I think there's kind of still more to do in terms of how that understanding could create new metrics.
John.
Julie, I have two terrible ideas for you. And they both regard terminology. I expect it's too late for your book, but it might not be too late for this paper. The first is your use of the word myth to refer both to what you regard as scholarly falsehoods, beginning with Smith and Malthus and going up to the present day, and for Mesoamerican cosmology. Now, I recognize, and everybody in this room recognizes, that the word myth has multiple meanings, but if your work achieves the audience that it ought to achieve, lots and lots of readers, then I think it invites misunderstanding. And I wonder if there's a way to differentiate, maybe just use the word cosmology in one context and the word myth in another. That's my first terrible idea. The second one is with respect to the word fail as you use it, that you're recasting the success of Europe as a failure. Can you fail at something you do not attempt to do? Have I failed at writing a symphony? I've never tried. To me, what's happened is that Europe failed the rest of the world. And that is a different, that's the verb fail with a direct object. And it's a different concept than Europe failed as an opposite, a reframing of Europe succeeded. To the extent that Europeans got rich and powerful, this represents a conscious ambition on the part of a fair number of Europeans. So in that sense, they succeeded in an object. In doing as they did to Mesoamerica and other parts of the planet, they did not fail because they were not trying to preserve soil fertility and nutrition and all the other things. So I'm a little uneasy with that. And so my second terrible idea is that you find a slightly different terminology for what you're getting at.
I'm looking forward to hearing all of them, John. Thank you so much for this. I like the advice because I would actually like people to read my work and not to sit on a dusty shelf somewhere that nobody reads it. So this is very good to think about audience and who it's speaking to as well. I suppose just to take the point on fail, I just did it here to make a bit of a provocation, thinking about the kind of historiography of global history and so on. I don't think it's necessarily a term that I would sort of continue in the project necessarily, although it did help me to think about narrative structure effectively. And I think kind of, these words as well that you mentioned, myth, we talked about this also yesterday. I suppose I'm thinking about, what the metrics can be and, can we, what does this look like also if we kind of aggregate a set of metrics and then, how would our graphs look now? But effectively, what's the historian's craft? And I think that is about narrative. And and potentially narrative would be a better word for it. And I suppose what I'm pointing towards is this kind of a narrative structure that deals with time in a particular way. And actually, myth has this sense, cosmology has it also, that time could be cyclical. We're so used to thinking in sort of linear time within the historical tradition, and within the way we think about sort of poverty and wealth as well. And so I think it was I'm still sort of testing the water on thinking, what I can do with this, but I'm wanting to sort of get out of certain categories, but also certain narrative structures. But I think that point about who it speaks to is really important. I suppose also with kind of thinking about failure, yes, on the one hand, kind of using it to be kind of provocative in this context, but I think it also links to kind of the thing in the book that I've just done on the moral political economy of the Spanish Empire, that when we're talking about kind of, for example, an economic story, there's kind of like there's a moral context to that, and actually kind of failure sort of points towards that as well. But as you say, it's probably not one to kind of keep and run with, because then it gets into this whole kind of question of intent and agency, that it's not kind of what I want to be foregrounding in sort of doing this, but definitely sort of thinking about narrative structure. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia. Sven?
Thank you. This was very stimulating and kind of refreshing. It's like totally reframing how most of us think about the making of the modern world, which I think is wonderful. And I think you're really up to something, when it comes to the early pre-modern world, that I think, the production of wealth and poverty, I mean, I generally quite relate it, but I will talk about this a little bit later myself. But up to 1800, I think much of the kind of European success story, so to speak, is really a story about redistribution of the wealth of the world, and not about great new ways of producing more with less human labor. Yeah, but this comes in later. So I think there is definitely a story to be told. But then when it comes to the modern era, the world changes quite drastically, in that now really much of the wealth produced in Europe and then also in other parts of the world is really related to enormous productivity gains. I mean, we can objectively produce now much more than we were able to produce in 1800. And that, of course, also relates to food systems. So I'm just, I think this is the critique you're going to encounter. So world agriculture has become, in ways that you know better than I do, but it has become drastically more productive today than it was in 1800. The social structure of the world has changed drastically. Now, more than half of all humans live in cities. Obviously, there is a difference between a world in which 97 or 98% of all people live on the land in the countryside and engage in agricultural activities, and thus can work in systems such as the ones that you described, than a world where a much, much, much larger human population now lives in the majority of which lives in cities. So presumably that has an impact on the possibilities of agrarian life and the production of food in the countryside. And then, if you think about the previous paper on land redistributions, I mean, so much of these land redistributions was actually to end peasant agriculture. I mean, 97% was probably aggregating land into larger units, inserting more capital, more chemicals, more energy into the land to produce more food with fewer people. So the land redistribution story, I think there's a slight tension between the liberations of land redistribution, as we have heard, and the undermining of the kind of peasant agriculture that you celebrate in your paper at the same time through the same policies. Okay, I think I leave it at that. I don't have really an answer, but I think you're going to encounter this critique, and maybe then also you're going to encounter, from people who are less well inclined towards you. They might emphasize that, for example, Maya society had certain aspects that we would not want to aspire to in the present, such as human sacrifices in order to increase rainfall. So I just wonder how you would deal with that kind of critique too.
Well, the human sacrifice was exactly to produce rainfall. This is I guess there's an interesting thing there about the kind of this point about cosmology and different relational ontologies. I'm not saying we should go back to human sacrifice. That's not what I'm advocating. want that on record. But I guess there's a sense in that kind of nature, the limits of nature and its gifts needs gifts in return, and it has a limit. And there's even this sense that that even what were domesticated animals in the Mayan world. Actually the way that you maintain a hunting ground could be a way of thinking about domestication to a certain extent. But you're not domesticating the animal, you're domesticating the kind of larger environment, and that's this kind of thesis of the Mayan forest, that land is not abandoned, but the kind of abundance is kind of managed. So sorry that I got distracted by sacrifices. But the point on cities as well, I will come back to the other points that you had, but when we spent a lot of time working with agroecological communities in the south of Mexico and thinking about the Mayan food forest, and we felt like, we're living in Glasgow, right? Glasgow has really high levels of poverty, high levels of food poverty. What's the term? Food deserts and all of this. And we thought, well, this doesn't seem to kind of relate to an urban environment and so on. And actually, on this has inspired us to kind of develop a project on sustainable cities, which is itself is kind of a problematic notion. But it got us thinking about urban agriculture. And it also relates to the Mayan forest garden, because what Annabelle Ford and Ronald and I have been talking about is the way that actually it's not, there's not this kind of binary separation between the city and the countryside. There were two dominant forms of agroecological production. One was the solarism growing within the city, and the other was that people could also manage the milpa from the city and so on. And so there's kind of this dialogue between this city, as it were, and nature. And that's another kind of binary that we have for the Western cosmology, to think about the city in a particular way as kind of separate from nature. This is kind of a Mayan forest city, a garden city, and that's kind of was really exciting for us to think. I was thinking, can we do a policy proposal that kind of engages with this historical model? My lawyer political economy friends told me no, because it's not going to be sort of so compelling to say, oh, do you know what the Mayan forest garden cities were like? But I think that there's possibilities there, and I don't know whether this kind of goes back to your question, Joe, about kind of what's different here. And I think that there's kind of in this kind of pre-modern historical societies, there's potential for kind of understanding different ways of being and worlding that include also different ways of conceptualizing cities and nature and so on. Is this an early modern, a kind of medieval and early modern story, and can it be relevant to the modern period? I think that's going to take some thinking about, and I think anyway, if this does develop, it'll be kind of a interdisciplinary project that will need a modernist to kind of speak to that. I've got 2 time periods covered a bit, but I guess if I start kind of presenting myself also as a modern historian, I'll probably get even more criticism. But just the other point that I wanted to make on that point, though, is that there is a link between the early modern period and the modern period, and this is the kind, and I think about it in terms of ideas and this kind of world belief that crystallizes around extractivism. And I've just written an article on the imperial foundations of concepts of inequality or something like that. And I look at the kind of likes of Francisco de Vitoria, who looks at kind of the way that resources are kind of conceptualized, the way the natural world is being conceptualized as a kind of source of commodity, effectively. And I think that kind of maybe there's something that can then speak to how resources are being conceptualized and extracted, and how that's kind of being conceptualized within a moral framework as well, that kind of is important to the way that then laws emerge, because for something to become legally normative, you have to make a case for it being morally just. And so there is this kind of set of ways that thinking about this might be useful, I guess.
Thank you. Nancy at the back, Nancy Van Dusen.
Hello, Julia. I'm Nancy Van Dusen, and thank you for crossing the ocean to be with us. So my question is, I'm thinking about, you're talking about Mesoamerica, and I'm assuming you're talking about the Mexica Aztecs as well. correct? Yeah. So these are people living in a city of about 100,000 inhabitants on an island by 1519. And abundance, if you're thinking about abundance, it's to sort of survive and sustain that population. It is based on the subjugation of other indigenous polities over that 100-year period before the Spaniards invade. And they're not only subjugating them, in some cases sacrificing them if they don't agree to their terms, but they're extracting resources from those subjugated peoples for their own benefit, and especially for ritual consumption. And here I think of them requiring subjugated polities to pay tribute in like ocelot furs. So, you know, the killing of animals that are not common, or the extraction of thousands and thousands of the feathers of rare birds that they use to support their cosmological beliefs. And so I'm wondering if you would comment on that.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for coming and for this really important question. I didn't know there was going to be a specialist in the room, otherwise I might have pitched it in a slightly different way. This was kind of very much pitched as a kind of provocation, around this theme of remapping and so on. You're absolutely right, kind of Mesoamerican societies, if we can talk about them in this generalized way, were status-based societies with kind of their own kind of forms of inequality. And there's actually been an interesting work trying to quantify that that's just come out as well. And of course, then the Mexica Empire develops in this way that it becomes a tributary state that's extractive. There's slave labor. There's different forms of slave labor, including the Tlacotin debt payment system as a kind of alternative form of scarcity mitigation, a kind of strategy of scarcity mitigation. So I guess talking about this kind of policy brief aspect. It's not going to be sort of advocating like, oh, we should be like this, but rather kind of what we can learn from thinking about these societies and their technologies of abundance. Now, I do think there's a difference between the Mayan world and the world that kind of comes into the being with the Triple State Alliance and the way that it kind of expands with these kind of flower wars and it is very extractive and so on. And I've been trying to kind of get a grip on this more for the kind of Mayan world. Which is the subject of this Mayan forest garden and so on. And there is also interesting work around how there may have been a certain voluntary participation in the state-making process of the Mayan city-states that existed because of the way in which the Milpa enabled different forms of like communities to exist regionally distinct from urban centres. And so, there's a suggestion there's a choice factor going on there. And what's the choice factor? Well, you might say it's precisely because of the kind of rituals, because there's a kind of a sense that this, nature is precarious. It gives to us, it might not give to us. Who's going to mediate that relationship? And so one could actually kind of leave, and people did. And actually, this is why the Mayan region, and like in the book of Nancy Farris, the collective enterprise of survival, the Milpa becomes this strategy for resistance, and it makes the Maya region like harder to colonize for this reason, because there's a possibility for kind of population dispersal, but there must also be a rationale then for population nucleation, and that doesn't kind of get us away from the question of inequality, but it makes us think about like human societies in a different way. And I suppose I'm not saying let's go and do some human sacrifice at lunchtime, but it's even the way that that's done in a kind of symbolic way, with the way they made the kind of amaranth kind of sculptures of the gods that they would then ritually dismember and eat over several days, and that whole history of then what the role of amaranth seeds is playing in that society. I just think that looking at these things, not to put anything on a pedestal, not to romanticize, because that's the problem with like looking at any indigenous histories, romanticizing extractivism, but rather kind of like how does this shift our thinking on what's normative, I suppose, is what I'm trying to do. But thank you very much for this question.
Samuel.
Hello, thank you for the interesting presentation. And I think my question is somehow preemptively asked, but I want us to dwell a little bit on your concept of failure of the West. I come from, Northeast Africa, a place known for poverty and failure. And I see Toronto, London, and all the places that I go for archival research, and I say, these people are like, they succeeded. They succeeded in accumulating capital. They live longer. They look happier. They look healthier, and we on the other side are still, struggling to survive. So the question, I guess my question is, your concept, your reframing of failure and success seems to be a little problematic for me. Maybe, I don't know. And a second question, a comment is, there seems to be a tendency of fetishizing like non-Western societies' relationship with nature, as if we, as if we don't engage in extraction, as if we don't attempt to survive by any means necessary. Sometimes there is this cheeky saying that I think Mkandawire, I guess, who says, if we have to kill the elephants and eat them, we have to kill them, and if we have to do that in order to survive. So that tendency to fetishize the non-Western society's relationship to nature seems to be also problematic. If you can comment on that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for these two really important points. The point on failure, as I say, kind of using this as a provocation to think about changing the narrative. Of course, we're here at this Global History Conference, and the poverty in Africa is directly related to the wealth that's accumulated elsewhere. And I suppose that's what I'm saying, that's the failure. Global history helps us to see the connection. And now, what if we focus on this as a kind of retelling of kind of how we ended up with these kind of like moral failings to people and the planet, I suppose. And in terms of, I also, I have this problem with GDP as an aggregate, as I'm sure we all do, like an aggregate metric of wealth. And, the likes of a city like Glasgow is a really interesting city to work in, because if I go for a run along the river and I turn right one way and I turn left the other way, the life expectancy between these two neighborhoods is like 40 years difference. There's kind of real abject food poverty in Glasgow as well, and it's not a unique city to have these problems. And I suppose kind of classifying nations as kind of rich and poor obfuscates that to a certain extent, but it doesn't. I hope that doesn't distract from the fact that kind of poverty in other places is extreme and experiencing it in a variety of different ways. I kind of with the Poverty Research Network, the project that I had back in 2016. I sort of frame this as thinking about the narratives behind the numbers, and sort of the need to kind of like pluralize our understanding and sort of say to people, how do you, and what's poverty for you? What does wealth look like for you? And I guess, there's the development agenda like that came out of, arguably the legacy of like imperialism as well, has been to say, right, yeah, catch up, develop, like in this particular way. We know that economic growth, we can't cure poverty through economic growth, because the planet would have to, if there's no redistribution, the planet would have to grow however many times it is. And so actually we need to think how we're living everywhere. I take the point that you make in relation to this about kind of romanticizing or the neo-extractivism of looking at indigenous populations. In the paper, I try to kind of say actually indigenous or peasant. It was a term also that came up in Chakrabarty's paper about emphasizing peasants who are kind of more, potentially more in touch with different forms of small-scale farming in a variety of ways. And I think maybe bringing that back in is important because, yeah, it's not like what I try to do by framing it's all about myth is to kind of go first of all to that kind of problematic binary and say, like, actually there's different, let's further provincialize Europe, to use that kind of Chakrabartyan term, by seeing this as kind of a set of ethnocentric concepts and then saying what else is out there. and how does the world look if we go from those metrics. But I take the important points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Maxine.
Thank you for this very interesting paper. I'd just like to follow up on the last two comments, and particularly Nancy Van Duzen's question over the tributary states. I just wonder if there could be some discussion of common rights and property rights. I mean, I know property rights is a bad word, but on the Northwest Pacific Coast, the 15 different language groups with numerous different branches in them had very precise definitions and notions of their property rights. And that's property rights not just over land, but over the shore and the sea. I just wonder, I mean, this is set out in very interesting ways in Joshua Reed's book, The Sea is My Country, which is a history of the macaw on the coast. And he's got very close analysis of their tributary relations with the Quileute, the other groups in the area, and it goes back. This goes back to the myths that you discuss of the Enlightenment thinkers, etc., of these pristine landscapes where it was presumed there was no property held. Those who called themselves explorers or merchants or whatever, they set up their surveying equipment, they set up their observational equipment anywhere they liked. They were in pristine landscapes. But they're very surprised, very shocked when they are challenged over taking wood or because these are spaces that there are rights on. So I just would be interested in your response to this.
Thank you so much for this. Also a really important question. And I think what I kind of want to do is just as a starting point is that disrupt this binary that we've sometimes had between kind of West and Rest, and then sort of like think, well, how do we build forward now? And I think what you say about property rights is completely true. There's not, we're away from the conceptual diffusionist model of the world where we have the sense that, certain concepts were developed in Europe and then exported to places where they didn't have them. Actually, there were different indigenous concepts and also some that might be exactly the same as, for example, property. But I suppose even between the way in which property is conceptualized in the Spanish Empire and the British Empire is different, right? Because the way that private property is a kind of a bundle of particular rights developed within the liberal tradition, advanced by Britain, is arguably quite different to the Spanish tradition, where you have this kind of multiple possibilities for different forms of communal property, which has enabled different forms of indigenous property to continue until the independence era. There's kind of an interesting work on this, and actually, because that was also recognized by the Spanish Empire, people can a lot of the kind of legal documents. Nancy's in the room, so I'm kind of very hesitant as to what I say now. But a lot of the legal documents are making kind of defenses of property. But there's all this literature about how that kind of engagement with colonialism also transforms, because people, for example, there's also, for example, there's a kind of myth of indigenous communal property structures, because people said, well, actually, that came into being through the kind of way that the Composiciones de las Tierras asked people to kind of finance the claim to property. So it meant that it was better for communities to kind of like pull together to advocate for the recognition of their property as a collective, as a kind of, I don't know if I'm summarizing the argument well, but as a kind of cheaper legal solution that gets them like property recognition. So there are all these different indigenous property forms that I think that we really need to know about. And there's also the ways that that is changed through the colonial concept. And, you know, I think the work on, I can't remember who it was now, maybe it was Eleanor Ostrom, I can't remember this need for the shift away from thinking about property as right to somebody, as kind of duty for somebody or nature. And I suppose, you know, I'm interested from a conceptual history point of view of exactly what does that look like? What does property look like in these? Because we can say, and there's a question of translation there. There's really interesting work going on by historians on Paraguay, trying to kind of create new understandings of translation by working with oral history workshop groups and different people from different disciplines to try to sort of rethink the translation around what different words, what concepts and words could have related, and then that potentially opens the possibility for understanding more categories effectively that are linked to kind of different sort of relational ontologies effectively. Because I think that, yeah, I'll stop. So I agree with you that that's important to bring into the picture. Yeah.
I think we need to talk about violence.
Yeah.
Julia, this dichotomy, the binaries between success and failure, the meaning of failure, the binary between redistribution and production, thoughts that have come up in the last half an hour. I'll just nibble away with what John and Sven said, and perhaps read your paper against Joe's paper earlier today. When you speak of failure, you speak, implicit in that thought is the axis of time, because we wouldn't be talking about failure of the West in the 19th century, even half of the 20th century. It is only the hindsight of time that actually shows that what might have been perceived as success eventually is failure. I know this is a simplistic observation on your concept of failure, but I cannot but think the role that time plays in this whole analysis. And the other is Sven's point about there's no new wealth production. There is redistribution, but what we do observe is production of labor from people who were not within the capitalist sphere in places like India. And Joe was talking about 1886, but I'll go back to 1792 in a permanent settlement in Bengal and Eastern India, which produces a huge body of migrant labor that feeds the fuel of global capitalism afterwards. And we can talk about enslavement. So I think the nature of the wealth looks different as we move from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century, but there is always this balance of production and redistribution. So those are a couple of inchoate observations I wanted to make. Maybe John, you
have. Listening to your discussion with Nancy about the Mexica Aztec state brings to mind a third terrible idea. And this would be really bad because it would require more work on your part. But I wonder, would it not be useful if you were to confront directly the presence or absence of states when you look at the Maya in the 15th and 16th century, you're looking at a decentralized population with comparatively low level of state exactions, tax, tribute, forced labor, military conscription. You move to the basin of Mexico and the Mexica state, and you see really high levels of all those things that rival the Ming, Muscovy, Ottomans, Inca states. So to some extent, we may be, in your paper, looking at places where the presence of states is low or the presence of states is high. And if you, in your work, could confront this directly and specify the kinds of implicit comparisons, make them more explicit, then I think you would be safer from charges of romanticization, which you try to confront in the paper, but this might be another way to address that. Just a little more direct confrontation with the relative presence, the relative absence of states and their exactions.
Thank you very much for this. And just to respond to Maxine's final point there about violence, you know, I'm trying to sort of, I know it's kind of not seeming foregrounded maybe in the presentation, but what I'm trying to do is kind of think about this kind of slow violence of poverty and inequality and violence kind of not only against people, but also about nature, which is kind of part of the history of climate change as all significant. So it is, I think you're right about violence, that, you know, is central to the story. And, you know, definitely sort of wanting to avoid charges of romanticization. I think I'm just kind of taking this provocation to think differently and how do we do this. I really like your point about governance, and I was really inspired by what Jo was saying in sort of thinking about these alternative possibilities of governability and governance in her paper as well. I've actually just written an article, there was a book chapter for there's a project called there's a group called the Global Middle Ages. They've had a work on zomias, you know, taking kind of James C. Scott's term zomias as ungoverned spaces and trying to look at what that looks like in different places in the world. And I wrote a paper to that looking at the Lacandon jungle that says actually you know, there's strong kind of traditions of autonomy and people kind of sort of fleeing to this area and forming kind of you know, beyond empire, beyond the state in the Selva Lacandona. But I try to rethink this not as I argue it's not a zomia. It's an alternatively governed space, and there's different like strategies for communal forms of governance. And so the process that we kind of shadowed in the Selva Lacandona with people today was they set out to make it's called Plan de Vida, a life plan, which is a new management plan, but it was based on kind of radical democracy. We've written a paper about how it's an example of grassroots constitutionalism, and I kind of try to use that work and also think about how this looks historically in terms of you know, the multiple iterations of the Selva Lacandona as a zone of refuge, but that actually opens up possibilities for alternative technologies of governance as well. So it's a really interesting topic.
Thank you. I think we are out of time and I'm hungry, so we'll wrap this up. Thank you, Julia, again, for a fantastic paper.